From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
So you think American politics is a mess? Well, spare a thought for Western Europe, which is experiencing a political breakdown of its own, an industrial policy meltdown along the way, and a marauding Russia on its borders, all on the cusp of the Eurosceptic Donald Trump returning to the White House in the United States. Today on Potomac Watch, the European crisis and what it means for the United States and the West. Welcome, I'm Paul Gigot, editor of the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal on our daily podcast. And I'm here with my colleagues, Joe Sternberg and Gillian Melcher, both based in London and traveling extensively on the continent, wide experience on the continent. So let's start just a little backdrop. Germany's government tripartite coalition collapsed not long ago. Election is looming. Britain's budget with the newly elected Labour government has been met with catcalls by the politicians and the people and the markets to some extent. A real winner there. And the French Prime Minister this week has resigned after a vote of no confidence in the National Assembly. Each of these countries is unhappy in its own way, but there is a common underlying theme of economic trouble and the inability of the political class to address pressing problems in a way that satisfies voters. So let's dive into these very big subjects. But Gillian, let's start with France. What's behind the collapse of the Barnier government?
Yeah, so there's an economic problem that is also a political problem here. And I think to understand what's going on, you really need to go back to last summer. So you had French people really upset about what they viewed as, their economic prospects aren't getting better. They're concerned about immigration and crime. And so they had European Parliament elections, and the hard right national rally did really well. And this freaked out President Macron, who decided, you know what, if I give the French another chance, they're going to forgo national rally. So he called snap parliamentary elections.
Really one of the great misjudgments in modern political history.
It was pretty exceptional. It was quite tone deaf. So he's going into these parliamentary elections just expecting that people are going to come back to their right minds, come back to him, and come back to the center. And that is absolutely not what happened. In the first round, you had voters going for the hard right. Then you had his centrists teaming up with the hard left to block them. He ended up losing seats to both. It was an anyone but Macron and the centrists vote. And so how does he respond? A new parliament? I've got a prime minister for you. He's a centrist. And I think at this point, French voters were pretty ticked off. And you've got parliament now divided between three incompatible minority factions. So coming up on all this, France has a debt problem. Its deficit is about 6.1% this year. That's about twice what's allowed for the European Union. So markets started looking at this and being freaked out. They needed to pass a bit of an austerity budget, but that's something that would be tough even if you had any party with a majority in parliament, which is not what they have. And so there's this sense of urgency around passing the budget. And France has this weird constitutional provision where basically the prime minister can bypass parliament, enact something without a vote. But Parliament's recourse is to do a no confidence vote. And that is what the hard right leader, Marine Le Pen, did this week. She ended up joining with the hard left. So the hard left and the hard right teaming up to take out the prime minister. That's the state of play. That's where we're at.
All right. So, Joe, there's deeper problems underneath this. Budget deficit in France is 6% of GDP. So is America's, by the way. Difference is that America's growing by 3%, has unemployment a little over 4%, and has a dynamic industry in AI, artificial intelligence. It has biotechnology. It has a much more vibrant, dynamic economy. Now that inflation is falling here, not falling enough in my view, but fallen down from its earlier heights, you're seeing an increase in real wages. That economic dynamism doesn't exist right now in France or, for that matter, Germany.
Yeah, I think, with apologies to Hemingway, what's happening is that Europe has sunk into a crisis gradually at first and then very rapidly over the past year or two.
You trumped my Tolstoy.
Well, we can also talk about how each country is unhappy in its own way later in the podcast. I mean, I think that sort of the backdrop to this is that we've known for decades that Europe had a problem with social welfare states that would ultimately be unsustainable, with kind of a whole regulatory and tax apparatus tacked onto the economy that was not going to be conducive to growth of the sort that you have in America. And we also have known for a long time that Europe was staring down the barrel of a demographic problem as the population was aging and the birth rates were falling, and there is no way that you can ever get the numbers to work on a social welfare state most of the time, and especially not when you have that kind of demographic change unfolding. Right. And so, you kind of have these long-term things that would have muddled along in one form or another for a while, and then on top of that, over the past couple of years, you have the Ukraine war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which triggered an energy crisis that really started in February of 2022. And that got tacked on to this more recent development of what you can best describe as climate fanaticism on the part of policymakers. I think that this attachment to the idea that you were going to pursue all of these net zero carbon emissions industrial policies that would completely reshape the way that your economy gets its energy, the things that you manufacture with that energy, the things that people consume and the way that they consume. And basically Europe is discovering that you can't do most of these things one at a time, and you definitely can't do them all at the same time. So I think that you end up with situations like the fiscal crises that are plaguing most European economies right now because the energy policies suppress industrial production. Germany is deindustrializing right now, if you look at this.
Right, Joe, that seems to be a particular problem in Germany. And of course, the Germans have long prized themselves on their industrial manufacturing prowess, but the cost basis of making anything in Germany now is becoming prohibitive.
Well, I mean, and that's a crisis for Germany, where the industrial production is falling by precipitous amounts compared to even just a few years ago. I think that industrial production must be down something like about 10% compared to its pre-pandemic peak in 2017. I mean, that's really a terrifying drop, if you're a German worker or voter. And then on top of that, you have the fact that Germany for such a long time has been the motor of the European economy writ large. And so I think that a lot of the economic and political traumas that they're going through right now are the fact that all of a sudden the political class has to deal with these series of escalating economic policy crises, and the politics is just not set up for that right now. I think that you don't yet have parties or politicians who are equipped to deal with any of that.
The problems in the largest European economies, of course, are of a particular concern to the overall European growth outlook. Gillian, the Ukraine war also bears down on this because it doesn't look like Putin is giving up at all. If anything, he's becoming more insistent on taking more Ukrainian territory, betting perhaps on a Donald Trump presidency that would maybe cut off military aid to Ukraine, although that's far from certain that Trump will do that once he gets into office. But Europe still hasn't adequately come to grips with the fact that they have a real threat on their borders, not on Germany's immediate border, but pretty darn close by historical standards. And they have talked a lot about spending more on defense, but there's a reluctance on the body politic to do that. And even now, when we're getting into this election debate in Germany, Olaf Scholz, the current chancellor, seems to be getting more dovish on Ukraine and called Vladimir Putin for the first time, I think, in over a year, a week or so ago, to try to persuade Putin to end the war. And he's playing there to voter sentiment in Germany.
Yeah, it's a dangerous situation. I think what you've seen across Europe is an expectation that there was going to be a peace dividend for the past couple decades, which has allowed the welfare state to grow and defense to atrophy. And European defense levels are not in good shape. I think one of the worst statistics that I read at the outset of the war is that if Germany had to fight something along the intensity that Ukraine was fighting, it would run out of ammo in a couple days. And so, they've now had a couple years to adjust to this. Well, how's that going? Ukraine intelligence coming out within the last month saying that next year, Russia, the much smaller, more beleaguered economy, is going to produce 30% more ammunition than the entire European Union combined. There have been modest efforts to fix this problem. But Europe's also had a real reliance on the United States. And I think that that is potentially what's causing this freak out about Donald Trump's election, is the idea that you might be on your own now. And Europe is not prepared for that. And I think Putin knows this too, and is seeing plenty of opportunities to test NATO and see what he can get out of it.
All right, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk about the economic problems that underlie the European malaise when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here on Potomac Watch with Joe Sternberg and Jillian Melchior. Joe, more than 20 years ago, in the wake of 9/11, I remember Henry Kissinger saying at a forum of European and American grandees that I was able to watch that one problem in Europe is that its leaders no longer believe they can ask their publics to make sacrifices. They're comfortable in their welfare states. They don't want to have to suddenly make sacrifices to build up the military, much less to actually send their soldiers into battle. They're very comfortable. And that's hard politically to shake. I mean, are any leaders that you see in Europe making the case, I guess maybe other than the Polish and the Baltic states, anybody in France, Germany, UK, or elsewhere saying we have to wake up out of our lethargy?
Only potential grounds for optimism you can see right now, aside from the Eastern European EU member states, the former communist countries like Poland and the Baltic states, who definitely get it when it comes to the Russian threat. Mm-hmm. But I mean, in Western Europe, I think probably the only bright spot right now is it'll depend on what happens in the German election, because if the center-right Christian Democratic Union, the CDU, led by a man named Friedrich Merz, if they end up performing well in the election, forming a government, which they're currently on track to do, I think that they probably get it a bit more than most other politicians or parties do in Western Europe. But I mean, if anything, it sounds surprising, maybe Kissinger was a little too optimistic with that statement 20 years ago, because you have to understand that it's not just people thinking about making the trade-off between defense and social welfare. The European public was promised in a way by the creation of the European Union that they would never need to think about that anymore. You were talking about countries, publics that had been so traumatized by the wars of the first part of the 20th century, and then along comes the creation of this continental institution where they were promised that they would not have to think about defense or that kind of trade-off anymore, because the security would be there. And even in NATO, kind of at the back of everyone's mind was the idea that the U.S. would be in this alliance to provide the backstop. So I think that you don't just have to get people to make that new trade-off when they're writing a budget every year in the government between defense and welfare and pensions and the rest, but you have to completely change people's attitudes and get them to rethink the way that they even think about what the European Union does and sort of what they have to do to provide for their own security in a dangerous world.
The responsibility for this, I think, unwillingness, if you want to put it that way, to face real problems, has to go back in part to Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, a longtime German chancellor before Olaf Scholz's government. And, she's the chancellor who appeased Putin. She is the chancellor who pushed through the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that made Europe more vulnerable to Russian natural gas supplies. She's the chancellor who pushed the end of nuclear power after the Fukushima reactor meltdown in Japan. She's the chancellor who pushed alternative energy in such a profound way that it has raised energy prices enormously in Germany. And they discovered at the onset of the Ukraine war that suddenly they had to rely on coal from Poland, for example, and all kinds of alternative energy supplies that weren't exactly solar and wind. And yet she was celebrated and still is celebrated by American liberals. She's making a book tour here with her book, and she's appearing with Barack Obama, her good pal, from their presidencies together. And if there were two people who bear more of a blame for Europe's vulnerability and for underestimating the threat from Vladimir Putin. I think both of those are at the top of the list. And by the way, Joe Biden has said the same thing about Barack Obama. So it's remarkable. There has been this otherworldliness among European leaders, Joe.
I think Angela Merkel perfectly represents everything that went wrong in the way that Europe thought about itself and the rest of the world over the past 2 decades, basically. Because, I mean, remember her personal story. She grew up in the former East Germany. I think that when she came to office in the mid-2000s, sort of like, there was the sense that she represented this new stage of kind of Germany's transformation into a united country, and it was one where sort of the impulse was going to be morality instead of any kind of realpolitik. And so that's how you ended up with this moral crusade on climate issues. What became in 2015 her moral crusade on immigration, and this notion, her Yes We Can, welcoming in hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants, that was hugely controversial. But it was because the instinct was that Europe didn't really need to make hard decisions about security anymore. So instead it could focus on virtue signaling decisions about moral issues. Mm-hmm. And reality has come crashing in again, as it tends to do. I mean, they're discovering they can't afford all of this moralizing on issues like climate or foreign policy that, by the way, actually is very morally destructive because it leaves you incapable of defending your values when, say, Russia invades Ukraine.